Welcome to our discussion on per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. In the past, these substances were referred to as PFCs, but are now referred to as PFAS or PFAS. As you can see today, we will go over several topics related to PFAS. First, we will talk about PFAS, what they are, their uses, and some possible health effects associated with the exposure to these chemicals. We will discuss federal actions taken by EPA to address PFAS. Then we will talk about state actions here in Alabama that we have taken regarding PFAS, specifically including the interim consent order entered into between the department and 3M. We will discuss in-stream PFAS monitoring. We'll talk about PFAS monitoring and minimization plans at selected NPS facilities. And we'll finish up by talking about monitoring of PFAS at drinking water facilities in Alabama. To start, let's discuss what PFAS are. PFAS are a man-made group of chemicals with very strong carbon-fluorine bonds that do not occur naturally in the environment. Three of the most common of these that you may have heard of are PFOA, which is perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOS, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, and GenX, which is a trade name for PFAS products produced by DuPont, which is now known as Chemours. While I just named three common PFAS, there are reported to be more than 5,000 PFAS compounds. When we talk about per and polyfluorinated compounds, what are we referring to? Perfluorinated substances are ones where carbon chain atoms are completely fluorinated. Polyfluorinated substances are ones where at least one of the carbon atoms are not fully fluorinated. Now, PFAS have been manufactured in the United States since the 1940s. PFOA and PFOS, which the chemical structures can be seen at the bottom of this slide, are no longer produced in the United States, but they are two of the most extensively studied PFAS. Like I said earlier, there are over 5,000 PFAS, and unfortunately many of the other PFAS have been studied very little, and subsequently less is known about them versus PFOA and PFOS. Many PFAS are thermally stable and demonstrate resistance to heat, water, and oil, as well as demonstrating electrical insulating properties. PFAS can be persistent in the environment and the human body. Now, over the years, the PFAS that have been produced and used in the United States have changed. Companies have generally phased out and moved away from the longer chain PFAS, ones that contain 8 to 12 carbon atoms, to shorter chain replacements, many of which contain 4 carbon atoms. These shorter chain replacements are thought to be generally less bioaccumulative and less toxic. Like I just said, many PFAS resist heat, water, and oil and have many other characteristics that may lead to their use in a variety of industries and may also be possibly found in a number of consumer goods. I've listed some of the sources and products where you may find PFAS, which include AFFF, or aqueous film forming foams, which is a firefighting foam that is used at a lot of airports and Department of Defense facilities. PFAS may be found in stain and water repellent treated products like Scotchgard for your carpet or furniture, or Gore-Tex for water repellent clothing. PFAS can also be found in polishes, waxes, paints, and cleaning products. And it also may be used in a number of facilities, including metal plating facilities, electronics manufacturing facilities, and oil recovery facilities, just to name a few. Waste from these facilities, as well as waste consumer goods that I mentioned earlier, may be sent to landfills. Therefore, you may find PFAS in the leachate that is generated at these landfills. The leachate from the landfills, as well as wastewater from these facilities that utilize PFAS, may be sent to wastewater treatment plants. Therefore, you may see PFAS in the wastewater discharges from these wastewater treatment plants. Many wastewater treatment plants generate a sludge. PFAS could possibly also be found in those sludges. PFAS can be found in certain food packaging, such as pizza boxes or wrappers for fast food burgers and things like that. Now, there are also some newly identified sources where one would not typically think that PFAS would be found. We just recently learned of a situation where a pesticide used to spray for mosquitoes was found to contain a PFAS. This slide's titled PFAS Web, which is very similar to what would be considered like a food web or something like that. And it provides you with a picture of the numerous ways that PFAS can contaminate the land, air, and water resources and possibly make its way back to the human body. If you'll see the industrial source to the left that may produce PFAS or may utilize PFAS compounds in their processes, many times they'll have air emissions that may contain PFAS, which could lead to human exposure. They produce waste and effluent that could lead back to PFAS being discharged into surface or groundwater resources. Those resources may be used as a drinking water resource, which could lead to human exposure. You have the fish in the surface water, which may pick up the PFAS, which could lead to a human exposure. These groundwater or surface water resources could be used to irrigate farmland or cropland, which could possibly also lead back to human exposure as well. Excuse me. As you can see, there are numerous routes that could possibly lead to human exposure to PFAS, and I only mentioned a few there. So, why should we be concerned about PFAS? This slide comes from the CDC website, and it basically indicates that a large number of studies have examined the possible relationship between PFAS levels in the blood and the harmful effects in people. However, it should be noted that not all of these studies that have been done involve the same groups of people, the same types of exposure, or the same PFAS. The different studies therefore reported a variety of health outcomes. Now, research involving humans suggests that high levels of certain PFAS may, and I would like to emphasize may, lead to the following. It could lead to the possible increase in cholesterol levels. It could lead to decreased vaccine responses in children, changes in liver enzymes, increased risk of high blood pressure or preeclampsia in pregnant women. It could lead to decreases in infant birth weight, and it could possibly lead to increased risk of kidney or testicular cancer. Now, at this time, scientists are still learning a lot about the health effects of certain PFAS, and they're also learning about the health effects of exposure to a mixture of different PFAS. So this is something that we'll be following as an agency as more research is performed in the future. We've talked about what PFAS are, where they're used, and some of the possible health effects associated with some of them. So let's now talk about actions that have been taken to reduce levels of PFAS in the environment. First, let's start with the actions that have been taken at the federal level by EPA. Before getting into some of the recent actions that have been taken by EPA, let's step back a little. In January of 2009, EPA released provisional health advisories for PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. These advisory levels were set at 400 parts per trillion for PFOA and 200 parts per trillion for PFOS. Then in 2016, based on additional science and information, EPA replaced those provisional health advisories for PFOA and PFOS with a lifetime health advisory for the combination of PFOA and PFOS, and that advisory was set at 70 parts per trillion. I would note that these advisories are non-regulatory in nature and are non-binding. In February of 2019, EPA released their PFAS action plan. A copy of the cover of that can be seen on the left. This 60-plus page document laid out actions that EPA had underway and included the next steps on 4 PFAS actions that they had announced at the 2018 National Leadership Summit. These included the fact that EPA would initiate development of a maximum contaminant level, or MCL, in drinking water for PFOA and PFOS. They would begin the process to designate PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under certain regulatory programs like the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, also known as CERCLA. They would also develop groundwater cleanup recommendations for PFOA and PFOS at contaminated sites. And they would develop toxicity values or oral reference doses for Gen X and perfluorobutane sulfonic acid, or PFBS. In addition to those actions, EPA laid out a number of short-term actions, ones that they felt that they could take within 2 years, and some long-term actions regarding PFAS. They stated that they would develop new analytical methods and tools for PFAS detection. They would promulgate significant new use rules under the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, and then they would continue using their enforcement actions to help manage PFAS risk, and this would be mainly done under the TSCA and drinking water programs. Now, I've highlighted a few of the items in this PFAS action plan, and it is not all encompassing. If you would like to take a more in-depth look at this document, it can be easily found by searching EPA's website for EPA PFAS Action Plan. In February of 2020, 1 year after the release of that action plan, EPA released the PFAS Action Plan Program Update to provide information on the activities that they had undertaken in the past year under their PFAS Action Plan, which included, in December of 2019, EPA validated Method 533 for identifying PFAS in drinking water. This new method can detect 29 different PFAS, which is a significant increase in the number of PFAS analytes as compared to past methods. In 2020, February of 2020, EPA issued a preliminary determination to regulate PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. If this preliminary determination is finalized, EPA would begin the rulemaking process to set the drinking water MCL for PFOA and PFOS. This regulatory process would include a public comment period to gather input on the levels and compliance methods proposed. In December of 2019, EPA issued interim recommendations for addressing groundwater contaminated with PFOA and PFOS. A screening level of 40 parts per trillion and a preliminary remediation goal of 70 parts per trillion were recommended in this guidance. EPA has also continued to move forward in designating PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA, which is also known as the Superfund program. And EPA continues to take enforcement actions regarding PFAS, mainly under the drinking water and TSCA programs. I mentioned the drinking water methods earlier. EPA is also working to validate a test method 8327 under SW 846, to identify PFAS in non-potable water like ambient waters and wastewater. EPA is also requiring entities beginning in 2021 to report PFAS compounds on their toxic release inventory. Now, this is only a snapshot of the actions that EPA has undertaken regarding PFAS during the past year. Many more are also underway. This document can also be found on EPA's website if you'd like to look at it in its entirety. Now let's turn our attention to activities that have been undertaken here in Alabama by the department. First off, I will go over activities that have been taken at 3M, the most notable manufacturer of PFAS in Alabama. As you can see in the map, 3M is located on the banks of the Tennessee River, just to the west of Decatur in Morgan County, which is in northern Alabama. The next couple of slides will give you an abbreviated timeline of activities that have taken place regarding the 3M Decatur plant over the years. The plant, shown in the picture here to the left, commenced operation in 1961, which included the production of PFOA and PFOS, as well as other PFAS. For approximately 20 years, from 1978 to 1998, wastewater treatment plant sludge generated at the plant was land applied on site. In 2002, 3M stopped producing PFOA and PFOS, and usage in the production process was eliminated by 2004. In 2004, 3M entered into a memorandum of understanding with EPA to provide information on PFOA through an environmental monitoring and assessment program. The activities under that MOU continued until about 2013. In 2008, 3M entered into an NPDES remedial action agreement with the department to address the former sludge application fields at the plant. Actions completed under this agreement included the installation of a multi-layer cap over the former sludge incorporation area, which is in excess of 300 acres, and also included the development of a groundwater monitoring program. In 2010, 3M submitted a PFOA and PFOS pollution reduction plan, which was required by the NPDES permit. This plan detailed activities that 3M would undertake to reduce the levels of PFOA and PFOS in the discharges of their wastewater. This plan was also modified in 2012. Also in 2012, the Alabama Department of Public Health issued its first fish consumption advisory for the Bakers Creek and portions of the Wheeler Reservoir, which is the Tennessee River, in the area of the 3M plant. There is now a no consumption advisory in this area. In 2014, 3M added groundwater extraction wells to the area north of the closed landfill on the plant site. In 2019, 3M notified both EPA and the department that 2 compounds, FBSA and FBSEE, which are PFAS, had been released from the Decatur plant in violations of the provisions of a TSCA 5E order and ADEM regulations. Then on July the 24th of 2020, ADEM and 3M entered into this interim consent order. This interim consent order requires 3M to undertake activities to reduce the levels of PFAS in wastewater, air emissions, soil, and groundwater at the site in Decatur and the other sites around the area. The order also requires 3M to undertake additional studies and report the findings to the department. This order was developed in consultation with EPA, both at the national and regional level. So in the next several slides, I'm going to briefly review some of the requirements of this interim consent order. So what is required for wastewater? First off, it requires the installation and operation of granular activated carbon treatment systems, or GAC systems, for the groundwater extraction wells, for the fluoroelastomer process at the plant, and then a larger GAC system for the wastewater treatment system. This slide gives you an overview of the wastewater treatment system at the plant in Decatur. As you can see here in blue, groundwater that is extracted from wells on the site flows through that groundwater GAC and then on to what we refer to as their conventional wastewater treatment plant, which is an activated sludge system. Wastewaters coming from the fluoroelastomer process flow through the fluoroelastomer GAC, then on to the conventional wastewater treatment plant. Sanitary waste and other processed wastewaters also flow to this conventional wastewater plant. All of that wastewater then flows through this larger wastewater treatment plant GAC before being released to the Tennessee River. This slide gives you an overview of that larger wastewater treatment plant GAC that has been installed. This is what they refer to as a lead-lag-lag system. They have 7 pairs of lead beds, and then they have 4 pair of lag beds. Each of these vessels contains approximately 20,000 pounds of activated carbon. Wastewater from the conventional wastewater treatment plant is split up and flows to one of the 2 lead beds. You have an active lead bed and a reserve lead bed. Once it comes out, this wastewater then flows over to the lag beds and is distributed among those 4 pair of lag beds, and it flows through one lag bed to another lag bed before eventually being released to the river. As I mentioned, on the lead beds, you have an active, shown here in yellow, and a reserve bed, shown in black. When the levels coming from these systems reaches a level of 0.5 ppm of soluble organic fluoride, or SOF, which is a measure of the total of the fluorinated compounds coming from that, then these beds are swapped. The active bed, the reserve bed then becomes the active bed. What happens then is this bed, the activated carbon, would then be changed out. Let's back up a couple of slides. What else is required for wastewater at the plant? Excuse me. Within 1 year of issuance of the order, 3M is required to install a cooling water recycle system, moving away from their once-through cooling configuration. Any blowdown from this system would then be routed to the wastewater treatment plant for treatment. This system is on track to be completed by the second quarter of this year. 3M was also required by the order to develop a plan to reduce PFAS discharges coming from their processes at the plant. This includes items such as cleaning of process equipment and reduction in associated wash water in the processes. This plan is due to the department within 270 days of issuance of the order. Within 120 days of the issuance of the order, 3M had to submit to the department a study regarding the feasibility of the installation of additional wastewater treatment control technologies such as additional GAC, reverse osmosis, and the possibility of moving to a completely closed-loop system with no wastewater discharges. This study has been submitted to the department and is currently under review. Now, there are also other requirements regarding the operation, maintenance, and reporting of wastewater discharges that are encompassed in the order. So what is required for soils and groundwater? Work has been done in the past regarding characterization of soil and groundwater contamination at the site. This interim consent order requires 3M to submit a sampling plan that would describe how they will fully characterize the PFAS levels in the soils and groundwater at the site. Within 630 days of issuance of the interim consent order, 3M must submit a written report detailing the findings of their investigation. Then a remediation plan would be submitted to the department detailing the remedial efforts to be undertaken to address the PFAS contamination at the facility. The Avenue A ditch is a ditch that runs through approximately the middle of the facility. Groundwater containing PFAS appears to be surfacing in this ditch and then flowing through one of the stormwater outfalls onto the Tennessee River. 3M is required by this order to evaluate the feasibility of capturing and controlling this discharge. Waste from the 3M facility was deposited in numerous sites in the region around the plant. As these sites are identified, 3M is required to investigate these sites for soil and groundwater contamination and, if warranted, conduct remediation at those sites. These activities are underway and will be updated if new sites are identified. 3M is also required to identify private drinking water wells in the area of the plant and the off-site disposal areas that may have been impacted by PFAS. 3M is required to test the wells for PFAS and offer to provide connection to a public water supply or provide an alternate source of drinking water for the residents if the PFAS levels warrant. This plan has been submitted to the department and is being implemented. So what is required for air emissions? The order requires 3M to install carbon adsorbers on 2 of their process reactor systems, which they refer to as the 340 and 470/471 systems. These systems have been installed and are operational. 3M is also required to perform testing on these systems to determine the efficiency of these control devices. 3M was also required to submit to the department within 90 days of issuance of the consent order a plan as to how they would characterize the PFAS air emissions from the various point sources at the plant. This plan was submitted within the required time frame and will be implemented. In addition to the carbon adsorbers already installed, 3M is also required to conduct a study to determine the feasibility of the installation of further air pollution control equipment to further reduce air emissions of PFAS at the plant. What else is required by the ICO? Many PFAS do not have associated lab methods or standards. By March 31 of each year, 3M is required to provide a report to the department identifying all known lab methods, detection limits, and reference standards for PFAS that are associated with the facility. If new methods have been developed, 3M is required to provide that information to the department. Within 180 days of issuance of the interim consent order, 3M is required to conduct non-targeted analyses of representative air emission points, wastewater and stormwater outfalls, soils, and groundwater at the facility in an effort to identify previously unknown PFAS at the facility. The order also requires 3M to conduct an in-stream PFAS characterization study of surface water, sediment, and fish tissue in the area of the plant. The plan to accomplish this was due within 30 days of issuance of the order, and 3M is required to implement the plan after the department's approval. The plan was submitted and has been reviewed by the department. For the 5 pollutants shown on this slide, 3M is required to conduct toxicity studies in an effort to determine parameters to be utilized in the evaluation of exposure and risk for these substances. EPA's Office of Research and Development will be assisting the department in the review of the data from these studies. The plan for these studies is due within 180 days of the issuance of the order. Regarding environmental studies, 3M is required to provide a report to the department detailing chemical-specific parameters for PFAS at the site that will be used to evaluate fate and transport of these chemicals. This report is also due within 180 days of issuance of the order. The order also states that 3M cannot object to the department including the requirements in the order into permits issued by the department. The order contains a cost reimbursement component to cover the department's cost of implementing the order. Under these provisions, 3M is billed by the department on a quarterly basis. And while there was no upfront penalty associated, the order does contain stipulated penalties if 3M doesn't meet the order requirements or the associated timelines. Now, I've covered several items that are required by this interim consent order, but if you would like to read the interim consent order in its entirety, you go to our home page, which is shown here, click on the e-file button at the bottom right, and it will bring up this e-file page. And on that e-file page, click on the water media area, insert the permit number shown here, and it will pull up all the documents associated with this facility. Then you would search for a document type of ECO dated July 24th of 2020, and that will be the interim consent order. Then you can download it from there. Now, over the past years, the department, along with EPA, have performed sampling for PFAS mainly in the Tennessee and the Coosa rivers, which you can see here on this slide. The Tennessee River here, the Coosa River here. Lots of sampling has been performed in the Tennessee River since 3M and other industries that might discharge PFAS are located there. The levels downstream of 3M in the Tennessee River have historically been measured above the 70 parts per trillion lifetime health advisory that I mentioned earlier. A downstream drinking water system, the West Morgan East Lawrence system, has installed a granular activated carbon system and is currently in the process of installing a reverse osmosis system to further reduce the levels of PFAS in their drinking water. As I noted earlier, there is a fish consumption advisory in the Bakers Creek area of the Tennessee River near the 3M plant. And currently, the Alabama Department of Public Health recommends that no fish from this area be consumed due to the PFOS levels in the fish tissue. Now, moving over to the Coosa River in the Weiss Lake area, significant sampling has also been performed in this area in the past, and that sampling began after drinking water sampling indicated high levels of PFOA and PFOS at two drinking water plants in the area, which were the Gadsden and the Center plants. I would like to note that Gadsden has a granular activated carbon system installed and operational, and Center is in the process of installation of a granular activated carbon system. We hope it will be completed very soon. In addition to sampling in the Weiss Lake area, EPA has also moved back up into Georgia, further up the Coosa and into the Chattooga River, and done a lot of sampling in that area. And right now it appears that the sources of PFAS that we've been seeing in Alabama in the Weiss Lake area is coming from sources in Georgia. It's my understanding that EPA and Georgia are currently working to address those sources. I've circled the Alabama River down here further south in Alabama. I'd like to note that the department will be conducting PFAS sampling in the Alabama River this year downstream of the Maxwell Air Force Base. We're currently in the process of determining the exact sampling locations, and like I said, we'll be sampling later this year. Now, the department has required, some industrial facilities to monitor for PFAS in their discharges. Some of the facilities where this has been required are certain chemical plants, certain landfills, certain municipal wastewater treatment plants, some Department of Defense facilities, and we even required one quarry in the northern Alabama area to sample for PFAS in their discharges. And based on the results of that monitoring, and in the absence of in-stream water quality standards for PFAS, the department has required some of these facilities to implement PFAS minimization plans in an effort to reduce the level of PFAS in their wastewater discharges. Regarding drinking water, public drinking water sources in Alabama that were not previously tested under UCMR 3 were required to test during calendar year 2020. UCMR stands for the Unregulated Contaminants Monitoring Rule, and the UCMR 3 testing was done during the 2013 to 2015 timeframe. For the sources that we were required to test during the 2020 calendar year, if the source of their drinking water was a groundwater source, we required them to test twice during the year, once during the first half and once during the second half of the year. Surface water sources were required to test once during each quarter of the year, yielding 4 sample results. I would like to note that no PFOA or PFOS concentrations in excess of that 70 parts per trillion lifetime health advisory were noted other than in the Coosa River near the Center drinking water plant, which we were already aware of, and like I mentioned earlier, Center is in the process of the installation of a GAC to treat that groundwater. If you'd like to review the results of the monitoring that was performed, you can go to our website and go to the What's Happening in Your County page. Link as can be seen here, and you can review the results. I'd like to also note that the results of this monitoring have been forwarded to our land division for them to possibly investigate some possible legacy or ongoing sources in areas where the results showed PFAS levels higher than we expected. I'd like to also note that PFAS will likely be included in UCMR 5, which is expected to be finalized in 2021. The sampling under UCMR 5 would be conducted during the years of 2023 to 2025. We've gone over some information regarding PFAS today, but if you would like to review any information in our files related to PFAS, you can go to our Efile page. And if you remember how I showed you to get to the Efile, and then when you get to our Efile page, click on the Air, Land, and Water Media, and under File Name, insert PFC, and that should allow you to search and obtain any documents that we have in our Efile system related to PFAS. And as you can see circled here, this is a little bit of an outdated slide, but there's probably in excess of 2,400 documents in our system that contain information related to PFAS. I hope this information has been helpful, and I'd like to thank you and have a great day.